basically the classical model of beauty, the academic model of beauty, became the standard framework that led to the shunning of the ugliness of Byzantine art. Okay?
Okay.
Okay? So it wasn't, ironically, until the early 20th century when in modernism there was a valorization of folk art, medieval art, African art,
Right.
oceanic art, Asian art, that then through the modern lens of as valorizing aesthetic forms that were not according to the classical model of Greco-Roman standards. It wasn't until that moment that then the icon became appreciated for its aesthetic power and expressive form.
I want the world to be beautiful, you know? And I'm in, as Pseudo Dionysius says, beauty as the name for, as one of the names of God. It's the great creating cause which bestirs the world. So things come into being through their desire to have beauty. And so I've kind of been interviewing a lot of Andrew's people. And so, but also some organists and some, I'm trying to do a series where I'm really interested in the music aspect, naturally.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to do an interview with at least one expert from every major Christian chant tradition.
Okay, yeah, I noticed that because you did the Ethiopian, and you did also the Carpatho. And by the way, my dad initially came into the church through the Carpathos, if I'm not mistaken. He was definitely ordained through the Carpatho Russian diocese.
Really?
Now headed by what, Metropolitan Maximus, I think his name is.
I don't know.
You have him in the video, man. Yeah. I saw him. It's like, oh, there he is.
Oh, yeah?
No. It's Gregory. It's Metropolitan Gregory.
Okay.
I think he's named after Gregory of Nyssa, if I'm not mistaken. I might be wrong. Anyways.
Father Nick sent me like a lot of home style videos of people singing Carpatho Rusin, which took forever to figure out how to get off of Facebook and Instagram and all of this. But then it was good because it's not like professional, like Sony's not going to come after me for someone's home video of Carpatho Rusin chant from their dinner.
But it's good that you're actually doing that because I was around that parish. It was in Danbury, Connecticut, where my dad started off, and with Father Luke. And back then I didn't know much about the Carpatho Russian chanting tradition, and so the congregational chanting seemed strange to me. But I think it's good that you're like contextualizing it. You're like actually making it more like accessible, because it's important to show people that within the Orthodox tradition there isn't a monolithic way you do things. There are local traditions as well, and so it goes back to what you were saying about beauty being reflected on every single being that God creates. So one of the other names in the Dionysian corpus that is given to God is difference, and that beauty is
I forgot that
reflected
one.
in the uniqueness of every single thing. You see, and
Yeah.
so the particularized, forms that develop locally within the tradition are important to bring out as examples of how it's unity and diversity. And it's not,
interesting.
it's not just a rubber stamping or like a cookie cutter kind of like, thing that that is meant to guarantee correctness. Is more than that. It's a reflection of the living presence of the Holy Spirit in the church. And so if you don't have that it's like you don't want flat soda. You want it to like be you want it to have the carbonation, to have life.
Yeah.
So anyways,
I'm publishing this podcast in partnership with the Orthodox Arts Journal and New World Byzantine. The Orthodox Arts Journal is an online resource where you can find articles about Orthodox iconography, architecture, and music from some of the foremost pioneers in the field, such as Aidan Hart, Vladimir Morrison, and Jonathan Peugeot. New World Byzantine is the architectural design firm run by Andrew Gould, who in my estimation is the foremost Orthodox architectural designer in North and South America, bringing together a marriage of American design and traditional Orthodox building arts.
No, that's good. And I mean, I guess that ties into that's a metaphysical principle, right? Like I just rewatched I gotta say it's my favorite video I think Jonathan's ever done is the interview that y'all did. Just because I'm not a visual artist, but I like it. I go to a lot of art museums. If I'm in Europe, I'm going all the time, like I know a little bit, but I've never taken like an art appreciation course or whatever. I just know what I like and I try to listen some and figure it out. But listening to that interview was super elucidating, just with the different paradigms when it came to art,
right.
And then the integration of abstract art into iconography itself. But as you were saying, the degree of particularity, I think you said was it Macarius that said in the eschaton Paul is not any less Paul? Was it Macarius or was it Maximus?
I think it might have been Macarius. Yeah, it was in the Macarian homilies that I bumped into that.
Yeah,
that's
right. Which is great because like it shows a difference between that and like Vedanta or
that's a very important difference. Yeah, because like I was actually I was looking at this video on Rene Guénon, right, and he's talking about like the things harkening back to the principle, right? And like, but the way that he thinks about it is so mathematical that it's like the more it resembles the source, it almost sounds, the way he expresses it, as if it loses its particularity. You see, because his thing was like the deriding of individualism in modernity.
Right.
You see? And so but then what happens is that he creates such a polar distinction between manifestation and unity that like manifestation becomes like an erosion or a degrading of the unity of the principle. And so you see, if you're not careful, you become too fixated on uniformity, or too fixated on geometric structures to the degree where like it loses humanity. And like you're saying, if you look at it within the framework of a Vedanta tradition, like the individual itself becomes illusory. It has no concrete reality. It's just something that arises out of the illusion of manifestation.
It becomes subsumed into the transcendent, right?
Exactly. So the idea is to basically acquire knowledge And in acquiring knowledge, you realize that your individuality is an illusion.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you have in that system is ultimately the this regard for personhood. And so it's not a relationship with God as person. It's not a relationship
Right.
between two, like a loving relationship between two, persons. It's basically being subsumed into the abyss of plenitude, or however you want to see it, but ultimately it's impersonal. Anyway,
well, that's what I love about
that
that's
attitude,
what I love about sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
That attitude basically, it seems to me, runs the danger of then creating a distorted notion of tradition, because then tradition
sense.
has to be uniformity, depersonalized, completely subsumed into like formulaic principles that if you deviate from them, you're not being true to the unity of principles. So it ironically it ends up being mechanistic, right? Because you have to follow the pattern.
Right.
Okay. So the irony is that Guénon was anti-quantity, the realm of the reign of quantity, but the reign of quantity is largely mechanistic.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a strange, anyways, I'm just bringing that up because it points to how, if you're not careful with basic assumptions of being, God, who we are, just reality, metaphysical assumptions, it ripples into distortions about what it is that we're doing in liturgical art, or any kind of, for that matter, any kind of like art that we're engaged in. And so,
right.
So that goes back to what you were saying. It's like, by definition, you start off with what has been revealed in the tradition. And for us is the Dionysian corpus is, you can't argue against that. It's not. And some people, unfortunately, would want to make it as they want to, or they tend to filter it through the West. Like they think, it became popular in the medieval West and scholasticism, so therefore the Dionysian corpus is to be marginalized. It's like, no, the Dionysian corpus is an integral part of how we look at reality within the Orthodox tradition. It's taken for granted. The way we order the Proscomedia into like 9 ranks is he's talking about that 9 ranks of angels, and
right.
the liturgical experience, the way he describes it, in the divine hierarchy, and so all these things are undergirding what we're talking about. However, one thing that I would be careful about is this: while we're dealing with the truth of the metaphysical principle of beauty as a name of God, and it is in that sense objective, because it's like it's independent from what I think of it. Ultimately, he's beautiful, and there is something in me created after the image and likeness of God that enables me to intuit that beauty in creation, right? And to glorify God through that reflection of his grandeur, right? So we have to be careful with the conflating between the metaphysical and the aesthetic.
Okay.
Which is,
so what do you mean by that?
What I mean that I'm probably like, digging a hole for myself and getting into trouble. But what I mean by that is that, there is the development of the aesthetics from the 18th century, Enlightenment, right? With Kant and others. I don't want to get into woods with that, because I'm not a philosopher. I'm not an expert about that.
No, but I do have some questions about it that perhaps in what you're about to say will get to, because for example, the whole dichotomy of sublimity and beauty, whether that dichotomy should exist within a proper Christian framework.
I want to touch on that. That is a very, very good question. Now, problem is that in the current pushback against the aberrations that come out of modernity, there it has been the revival towards like the upholding of beauty, right? Which, I mean, your channel is an example of that you know, revival of awareness of, like, you know, the need for us to, like, you know, not throw that, you know, to the side. But I think the danger is, whether it is coming from, like, you know, a Orthodox, Roman Catholic, or Anglican, you know, conservative perspective, the danger, like, what a common thing is, like, beauty will save the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is that that saying is within a more complex narrative that is going on within that novel, right? Because
Right.
it's the battle takes place in the heart, but it's also what kind of beauty we're talking about, because the good and the truth is always beautiful, but the beautiful is not always good and true. And so then we're dealing,
Or maybe the sensuous is not always good and true.
well, okay, so that's what, so we have to make those distinctions. And that, I think that part of the problem is that those distinctions get muddled.
Mm-hmm.
And then we run into the danger of, which touches on iconography, because for example, you know, from the 1700s perhaps up to the 20th century, there was the westernization of, for lack of a better way of putting it, of the iconographic tradition, where, like, the Renaissance had such an impact that, like, then the traditional form,
like the classical
became,
icons in Russia.
Right. It became it you know, the traditional what we refer to now as the Byzantine style, became sort of marginalized for more of a romantic, Nazarene, you know, academic kind of painting in church art. So basically, the classical model of beauty, the academic model of beauty,
Okay.
became the standard framework that led to the shunning of the ugliness of Byzantine art. Okay?
Okay.
Okay? So it wasn't, ironically, until the early 20th century when, in modernism, there was a valorization of folk art, medieval art, African art,
Right.
Oceanic art, Asian art, that then, through the modern lens of as valorizing aesthetic forms that were not according to the classical model of Greco-Roman standards. It wasn't until that moment that then the icon became appreciated for its aesthetic power and expressive form. That for see,
just before we go on, let me make sure I'm following you. Okay. So so, like, there's the Greco-Roman, there's the classical form, and then basically all painting and iconography is roughly the same, with a little bit of particularity within regions, but it's all following whatever, you know, innovations and technical innovations have taken place at the time, right? So you can see technical innovations throughout the empire, throughout Byzantium, as it's getting more and more complex, until maybe you get to, like, Giotto or like, you know, where they start changing perspective. But then, because this all is within one framework that then ends up, you know, in, like, the later 1700s, ends up being not classified, but, like, delineated. They say this is the framework we're working with. Then they sort of see one progression from the Byzantine icon all the way up into, like, Caravaggio and, like, romantic painting. And so it's seen as, like, one line of progression that has gotten more and more beautiful, precisely but in the background, because of the technical innovations that have taken place. And then because of that, then the earlier forms of art are then seen as substandard and not as beautiful as those things which have taken place since then, right? And so then because of that, all the folk art is kind of discarded and not seen as beautiful. But then like post Duchamp, if I'm saying his name right, and then, within like modern art, there's this
it's
big critique.
Before Duchamp, I would say late 19th century, like even with the Impressionism in the 1870s and then 1890s, with post-impressionism, when there is a appreciation of like of Japanese woodcuts, for example, and like there is looking
or even
at,
like Van Gogh painting the peasant.
Right, yes.
Right.
So you begin to have a shift of form in representation that breaks with the clean, like academic sensuousness, okay, that you would have as expected of the salon in France, in Paris.
And so then because of that, now it opens up this new opportunity. It opens up the
possibility,
to be interested in folk art, African art, and actually to see a beauty in it.
Exactly.
So then it seems like there's two avenues from that. The one is the appreciation of the folk art, the African art, the Asian art, the like Byzantine icon. But there also seems to be like then the temptation to say that all of the technical innovation that has happened since then, because it was in this long line that then was prejudiced against the folk art, is intrinsically bad, which...
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Which is also not necessarily so, because
that's an exaggeration. Yes,
because those classical Russian icons are still icons, and they're still,
Yes.
So am I following you correctly?
Yes,
is that
okay. Absolutely. So yes. So you see, that's why it's more complicated. So when you hear people argue, for like beauty, I kind of like get apprehensive, because I'm like wondering, okay, so what model do you have in your mind? And it seems sometimes, not all the time, that it's a model that is basically primarily a 19th century academic model. And so I'm thinking about visual art. I'm a iconographer, so
there's parallels of musical stuff.
So then anything that is somehow designated as modernist, and I'm not using that term in the theological sense so much as a specific art period, right? Then is by default, it's like is the baby's thrown out with the bathwater. You know what I'm saying? And so that's where I'm like, okay, hold on a minute. I mean, the modernists did teach us a lesson. I'm talking about early modernism, right? And I'm not talking about post-Duchampian kind of like, conceptual stuff that's another topic.
Well, even then, it's like the colorists and that, like the idea of hyper focusing on things that can be integrated is one thing. But then there's, of course, the whole like the Ponzi scheme of let's just have like 7 levels of irony, and let's just paint some nonsense so that we can like make $1 million off of
that's not what I'm talking
scam
about.
Kind of
right. Which is clearly there and does exist, and a lot of the art world functions according to those attitudes. But what I'm saying is that whole trajectory itself that you delineated and that I've pointed out, it shows that in the realm of aesthetics, it gets complicated. So to present the metaphysical argument is not sufficient. You see what I'm saying? Because yes, beauty ultimately is a reflection of God. There is no question about it. And anything that is beautiful it's sort of like, you could say, it's like a ray of beauty with a capital B. It's like it takes you back. It harkens back. It wakes you up, so to speak, internally to yearn for the source. And so there is an eros. There is like the beautiful begets being, and insofar as a thing is living up to its integrity as what it's meant to be, it is beautiful. If it does not live up to that logos,
meaning that beauty is inherently teleological.
It's teleological, and also it's about the logos of being. A basic example is like for me to be a true human being, I have to be conformed to the image and likeness of God. I have to basically be deified for me to become who I am meant to be. And insofar I'm doing that, I am growing from glory to glory in beauty.
Right.
/ holiness. Okay? But if I'm withdrawing from that and I'm giving into sin, I'm distorting my being. And I'm slipping back into nothingness, formlessness, so to speak. I'm not being conformed to the likeness of the true icon, which is the Logos himself.
Sure.
God himself.
Yeah, amen.
Okay? So I'm losing that beauty that I'm meant to have. Okay? So but that's the ontological implication of beauty. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Based on the metaphysics of beauty, right? So
then can you apply that to a piece of art? It's
but that becomes complicated, because then you have to take into consideration different cultural, subjective attitudes towards form.
Right.
And that is a reality. You can't, in an attempt to argue against the quote aberrations of modernism or modernity, unquote, you cannot then give a simplistic argument that we have to go back to beauty, because that's the answer to all the distortion that modernism has produced. So metaphysically, yes.
It's like the critiques of postmodernism. Some of them are legitimate critiques.
Yes.
And some of them can be used to destroy materialism, it's like it's like don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Exactly. So the problem is in positing, in our context, an argument for beauty, we have to be careful that we're not just positing an argument for academic, sensuous painting. And it seems to me, and I'm sorry, for example, in the Roman Catholic, context, one of the things that they use as an argument for the distortions that we've experienced since, modernism is Baroque painting. Okay, so call me a modernist, okay, but I don't know if Baroque painting is necessarily a viable form in the liturgical context of, at least not in Orthodoxy, is definitely not. Okay, because for us, functionally, the icon is the form. So already, okay, so now we're talking about two nominal, two Christian communities. They're both positing like the argument of beauty, but they're giving you two different aesthetic embodiments of that. That's what I'm talking about.
It seems like there's two different spiritual practices between East and West, right? I was having this conversation with Andrew.
Yes.
And he was saying it's like the difference between the Christ who's dead on the cross. That wasn't a thing until the Gira crucifix in the 1000 something. It was always Christ alive on the cross. And he was saying this is also reflected between Eastern and Western architecture. And it's like in the East you are in heaven, and the architecture reflects that. And in the West you are looking up to heaven, and you are in darkness. Yeah. And it's not that either of them is false.
Right.
It's like they're both true to a degree, but it's two different ways. And there's two different sense of piety. There's the sense of I'm not going to go into the passions. I'm going to reject all of the passions. And so there's maybe you can achieve some sense of noetic beatific vision or something. But the icon is not meant to invoke sensuousness. Whereas then in Caravaggio, it is that very sensuousness which is then supposed to point you towards extra lamentation for sin and extra appreciation. just maybe because I'm Western, I'm not sure that, like, I think both are venerable, and I'm not entirely convinced that like the Western piety is intrinsically wrong, and but I mean, I could be convinced that it's intrinsically wrong, but to me, it's like two different methodologies. It's two different ways of piety. There's definitely problems with that Western sense of piety, but then it's like, I don't know. I'm not sure I want a world without Caravaggio either,
It's well, that's an interesting topic. I mean, that's for another discussion. But like I would argue that, like, in my from an Orthodox perspective, I would argue that our praxis is geared towards making you aware of the dangers of the over emotional and over sensuous. And so in the liturgical context, then the form has followed accordingly. Granted, there was a moment when the forms that resemble Western naturalistic styles, right, became implemented. Okay, whether it was in Russia or in Greece, or the Russian sphere and the Greek sphere. So, but I would say that my theory about that problem is that there was an experimentation that took place because of historical circumstances. For example, Constantinople collapses. There is a Turkish yoke, and there is, the iconographers go to Crete, and then there is a cross-fertilization going on with Western forms that are coming from Venice because Crete was under the Venetian, control. And so so iconographers begin to experiment with compositional and representational forms coming from the West, because the Byzantine convention had become, I'm sorry, if you're a painter, you get bored with it, okay? And they got sort of like, all right, we've exhausted what we could do with this. What are we gonna actually, we are seeing these new forms. What are we gonna do about that?
It's like, after the art of fugue, how can you write fugue anymore?
So you experiment, and so they started experimenting, and eventually what happened was that the printing press was, with the production of engravings, then the access of compositions coming from the West became more, common. And so they started actually taking compositions and then doing it in an iconographic kind of way. So it was like an attempt at synthesizing both forms, and it was sometimes more successful than others. Similarly, in Russia, you had Bibles coming from Lutheran kind of, origins with engravings, with illustrations of biblical narratives, and they started using these compositions as inspiration for iconographic works. And so that began the gradual then transition into the naturalism. So it seems to me like a natural confronting this novelty. It was like a natural way of how are we going to actually coexist, and what is it that our form really means for us to be doing this while this is happening. But these questions don't get answered theoretically until the early 20th century.
Okay. And are they answered then?
I would say that it took a while for people within the church to acknowledge and realize what you were pointing out to. Like that there is definitely a conveying of a specific ethos in specific visual forms. And so which forms do we want to actually protect as exemplifying what it is that we believe and the spiritual practices that we are engaged in or we're supposed to be engaged in? Will this be a contribution and help in that, liturgical experience, or will it not? Will it incite passions, or will it help in prayer and in drawing the mind to higher contemplation? And so that question then became verbalized more concretely in the writings of the revivalists of the icon, such as Cantiglu and Ouspensky, and then also Florensky, and so but the problem was that they then set out. I should put it. They articulated it in a way that was so polemically strong that like they created a
people are afraid to be creative after that.
Right. And they created a dual, like a polar thing where, like, if you do things in an iconographic form, is by default spiritual because it's abstract. And so they had adopted from the modernists this notion, and earlier art historians, Warringer, for example, who wrote this book called Abstraction and Empathy. And that became influential in the development of German expressionism and early abstraction, like in Kandinsky. Like, they took these notions of abstraction as equals spirituality and pitted it against naturalism equals sensuality. But it was done in a very stark and simplistic way. And so then what happened is that they began to interpret symbolically the forms of iconography as definitively meant to convey specific theological truths. So what happens is that then they began to dogmatize the style. Okay. So that's what led into the notion of the tradition as being just, you trace it and you repeat it, because you cannot invest it with any personal statement, because to do so is a compromise of tradition, because tradition is anonymity. It has nothing to do with the individuality. It has.
Well, there's difficulty because you're trying to hold two things in play. It seems it's like you're trying to hold. You want to preserve a tradition, but also you don't. But also, like, you want artists to be able to do their art.
Right.
You want composers to compose and improvisers to improvise. You want you want it to be alive, and you don't want it to be rigid. And so but it's like, if you allow too much of that, it will change over time. It is inevitable that changes will take place. Right. And so I mean, it's probably unfair for me, as not technically Orthodox, to criticize the Paris school, like Losky and Schmemann and those. And I love those guys, especially Schmemann's For the Life of the World is one of the best books I've ever read. And I know he has a lot of...
That was one of my catechism books when I first became Orthodox.
But it's amazing. But it seems to me that there's an issue, which again, may be unfair for me to criticize, but it's almost this impulse, especially within that whole school, to say, this is the East, that's the West. This is the East, that's the West. And I know they're trying to find their identity in the middle of exile, and they're trying to, like, there's a lot of beauty and goodness and all of that. But there's also, like, on the fringes of the empire, the East, like, the Orthodox were in Corpus Christi processions with, and like, Antioch communed with both East and West until the 16 or 1700s. And it's like, there was scholastic theology just as much in the East as there was in the West. And
I think what you're,
what I mean? Like,
yeah, I mean,
it's not as black and white as they pointed out to
basically,
be.
basically what you're saying is the difference between it's a couple of things that come to mind. They're like popping into my mind. First of all, I just want to take back the whole thing about like the Shmemen. I'm not a great fan of Shmemen. You know what I'm saying?
Okay.
But although he served a role in my development initially, like when I came into the church through the OCA, and of course, if you're gonna have like the OCA is gonna be advancing a lot of Shmemen because it's like he's one of the founders of St. Vladimir Seminary and so on and so forth. But he's not my favorite author per se. But in any case, he like what you're saying is true in a general description of what's going on with that community. And I think it has to do like which the pioneers that I mentioned, like in a way are a parallel to that. But I think it's I would call it the process of clarification, because it's true. On the ground, there is always going to be ambiguities. On the ground, there's always going to be compromises. On the ground, there is always going to be like different degrees of assimilating the mind of the church. There is going to be different pastoral necessities, and as how do you deal with heterodox groups. And so then that will then, if you try to like get the correct, if you try to apply the correct, lens to historical reality, you always will find that the historical reality is messy. And so, but the messiness doesn't mean that the theology is faulty, and or like the specific critiques of certain exaggerations of the West, in this case, as you were pointing out, are necessarily always wrong. It's a matter of how you do the critique, and that's and how you navigate the challenge of, while not compromising the tradition, still applying it in a way that is pastoral, and also it acknowledges, in the case of iconography, that is a living thing. You see, and so it's a complicated thing. So I would say that part of the complication is having the consciousness or the awareness, developing the discernment, the awareness of how specific approaches were faulty, or specific approaches might have been thought to be helpful but are no longer helpful, or specific visual forms or liturgical forms have lost their capacity to embody where we are in the church, not to express what it is that we actually do believe. And we realize, okay, in the case of iconographic form, we've decided, no, those forms are problematic. They do certain things to the heart and soul. Like there is a saying that I like to quote by, I think it's St. Peter of Damascus, where he says, what you contemplate, your nous is colored and shaped by what it is that you contemplate. And so, that is applicable to the issue of form. So I would say that while you cannot say that by default abstract form is spiritual, and by default naturalistic form is sensual, okay, you could say that there are parameters within the iconographic form that we have acknowledged as church community, that they cause the printings, so to speak, that are appropriate for the liturgical context. Sometimes it could go too far into abstraction, and you have to call it back. Sometimes it goes back, it's too far into naturalism, and you have to call it back. So I would say that it has to be a synthesis between thought and sensation. Too much sensation is sensualism, and too much thought is too abstract. So the form
now this mechanism for determining the two, right? That you would say like would be posited within like a community itself. So like let's just say like the Georgian Orthodox Church, right? Like they can determine based on their tradition.
Their
this has gone too far into sensuousness, and this has gone too far the other way.
Yeah.
I still am curious, and not to delve on it too much because I really I have a lot of art questions, you know what I mean. But this is fascinating to me. Is because there is a Western Rite Orthodox, with it within ROCOR, and I know most Orthodox tend to hate the idea of a Western Rite, but whatever. At least it's an affirmation that there's nothing intrinsically, fallacious about the Western liturgy itself. Is could Western communities, if there was ever legitimate rapprochement between East and West, could Western communities still hold to their own Western sense of piety with a certain distinction to the East, right? And then use that same mechanism and determine things in a different way? Or is the two forms of piety, in your estimation, mutually exclusive?
I would say, okay, pastorally, and this is very concrete for my relationship to Puerto Rico, because I was born in Puerto Rico and my dad has a mission in Puerto Rico. Mm-hmm. And so my dad is actually, to tell you the truth, Andrew drafted the architectural plans for my dad's church. And so
yeah, I got that on my notes of I should ask you about what the the progress of your dad's church is.
So the reason why I bring it up is because it is related to the Western Rite problem, and I would say that in a place like Puerto Rico, Western Rite is definitely not pastorally wise to have, because it will confuse people and it will not help them unlearn distortions coming from the Western tradition. And so there has to be a clear distinction between what our liturgical practice is, as exemplifying the mind of the Orthodox Church. Mm-hmm. And so that way people don't create a muddle of, perpetuating distortions that, because of a leniency towards the liturgical form, they become lenient towards aspects other than the liturgical form. You know what I'm saying? Because it's complicated. It's too, and not everybody has the capacity to do that. And I've seen it firsthand. In Puerto Rico, it's a very confusing, religiously speaking, context. You have a lot of storefront Protestant churches. I personally came from a Pentecostal, background. My dad was a pastor all my life. Yeah. And so and then you have the charismatic revival there, but historically is Roman Catholic, and then you have everything in between, and Santeria, and it's a nice way of saying voodoo. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So you have to make pastorally that distinction in a place like that. So I'm more hardliner when it comes to that. I'm not saying that that everything that comes from the West, like, for example, a very good example is this. I was reading this morning The Unseen Warfare by St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain, okay, or edited by St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain. But it was initially authored, that text was initially authored by, if I'm not mistaken, the author was Lorenzo Scopoli, and he was a Counter-Reformation Roman Catholic priest who wrote the book in different editions. But in any case, St. Nicodemus got a hold of it. He realized it was edifying, and he basically cleaned it up from whatever was not orthodox, put scriptural verses in there that supported the text, and added aspects of the orthodox spiritual tradition in it to beef it up and to give it the grounding that it needed for it to be contextualized within an orthodox context. And so that's an example of how within the church we have never been completely like, everything that comes from the West is evil, but we've always been careful as to how do you implement that understanding in order not to confuse people in their spiritual practice. Because I would contend that our framework of spiritual discipline is enshrined in the Philokalia and in the Palamite understanding of the hesychasm. The first, Sunday of Orthodoxy is, the first Sunday of Lent is a Sunday of Orthodoxy, then Gloria Palamas. So that right there is icons and hesychasm. So that is like already the framework. It's been enshrined in the liturgical life of the church as to, all right, how is it that you're going to understand what the spiritual life is all about? Acquiring the divine likeness, the icon, the veracity of the incarnation. And how do you do that? Through prayer and the aspiration towards theosis, as it has been articulated through the mouth of Saint Gloria Palamas. And that is basically, he is speaking from the continuum that we see enshrined as an encyclopedia, which came from St. Nicodemus, which you could say that he is, in a way, an enlightenment figure in Orthodoxy, because he is an encyclopedist, so to speak, of the spiritual texts of the church. Okay? Put together.
I have a copy of the Philokalia.
Yeah, put together.
I've read a little bit of it.
You should dive into that, man, and then you really get to see the clear difference between what's going on in the East and the West. And so, and so that's not to be taken as a quaint alternative that we could choose to have, as we choose to have sushi instead of a burger. No, it's
okay,
not.
So
you know what I'm saying?
Let me just say, fair enough.
It's not just in other words, it's not just in the realm of aesthetic taste.
I got you. And I've been around Orthodoxy for a while, and so maybe this is getting a little more theological than I normally get, because it's normally just, but whatever. Yeah. So I'll just to give you context of how I perceive of things, right? Sure. So especially theologically, I think a lot of the East's critiques are super valid. Now, this is me personally, right? So like the critiques of penal substitutionary atonement, totally there. People will hate me for saying this. I think the Filioque is more political than it is theological, but whatever, I can at least accept. I don't say it when I say the creed, Good.
You should.
And yeah. Then when it comes to other like Eastern Western things, you're talking about Palamas. I think the idea of the essence and energies, it just ontologically is amazing, and it solves all the problems that the West tries to anthropomorphize everything in the Old Testament. But this solves the problems, and it kind of also solves some of the problems with like the outpouring of God's wrath, when you understand it, and or at least the way I understood it from Hopko, who was trying to read it through like a Palamite lens, like there is a degree to which Christ experiences the wrath of God through his energies, but it's not divine infanticide, so it's like this, it's great because he can both affirm all of the passages that would be proof texts for, like some
the
like
whole
Reformed
wrath thing. I don't get into that
Presbyterian.
whole language because it's like the fathers, like I think it's in Gregory Palamas, like, and not just in Gregory Palamas, like Gregory the theologian. It's like it's anthropomorphic, like you say, anthropomorphic language used to speak about a specific mystery of our, like, that feeling of estrangement that we feel, experience from God. But in any case, it becomes misused. You know what I'm saying? Anyways, but I haven't,
for sure.
I haven't explored, because God is not passionate, and so He doesn't inflict his
impassible.
He's not like getting angry because you dishonored Him. It's just like it's just it's weird human imposing human passions to Him, and we don't do that. Anyways, go ahead.
And there is like a sense in which it's true, and there's a sense in which, in his essence, it's, so like, and I think that essence energies thing is super useful, and I wish that it was a thing in the West. So there's all kinds of stuff that, I'm like secretly, like, like, well, I want that, that's all. So I think the distinctions are important. The critiques are super important. So by no means when I'm talking about East-West, like I'm trying to purely talk aesthetically, just like, because theologically, I think, yes, there are distinctions to be made, and there are really great critiques that the East has of the West that needs to be taken more seriously than they have been taken. And so then, because of that, let's say, like, those are your priorities. I can understand, especially in a pastoral context, why you would say, okay, Western Rite doesn't work here because we're dealing with a different set of issues, and we're dealing with all the accretions of the Enlightenment and modernity and this, post-nominalism and all of these things that are really foreign to the Orthodox framework. So anyway, just to say, I think theologically the distinctions are important, and I'm not an ecumenist,
Right.
It's like
Me neither.
I'm trying to talk to people of all traditions and whatnot, but I'm also not for, like, the one house of Abrahamic religion or whatever it is in Dubai, nor am I a perennialist,
Right.
But it comes to the question of the aesthetic, right? So I mean, unless if I'm wrong, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that there is nothing intrinsically wrong with, like, the liturgy of St. Gregory, or like some of the Western liturgies. By very fact that, like, the Antiochians, like, have a Western Rite and Rocor has a Western Rite, even though they're very, very tiny. So then, like, liturgically, there's something that's not invalidated. So then if I grant the theological critiques and we get just to the aesthetic, right? There obviously is, like we were talking before, a difference in piety, where there is, I think it kind of boils down to, the East, of course, is great in the whole let's eschew the passions, let's not incite the passions, because we're trying to partake of the impassibility of God, But can you say that some of the Western piety that is directing the passions towards, like, a contemplation on Christ's crucifixion, that is, like, intrinsically wrong? Because if not, then you could see, like the growth of the Gothic as its own thing, that like, I don't put it this way. If there's ever true rapprochement between the two, I don't think that they have to get rid of La Sagrada Familia, or that they have to destroy Saint Denis, or and there are some who think that. So maybe you think that. I don't know.
I don't think that. I don't think that's a different.
But it just gives a framework for contextualizing, like, Western art progression.
Right. Yeah, that's,
you see what I mean?
This is a very complicated topic, because I think scholars of religion and theologians and historians, they're still at a loss as to how to interpret the trajectory of historical events. It seems to me, to really, with a balanced, interpretive lens of how did we get into all these different forms distinct from what took place in Byzantium. One of the arguments is that, like, in the West there was always a sense that, like, the the art was in the hands of the painters. Like that goes back to the Carolingian, like what was that, the when the iconoclasm took place, and then you had Charlemagne and his court like basically translate the proceedings of the Seventh Ecumenical Council, and they botched it, and they misinterpreted what they were saying in the East, and then the part of their argument included the notion that like we leave it up to the artists to determine what it is that they do in illustrating the texts, and it's like more of like an illustrative kind of like attitude towards the artistic act, whereas in the East there was more of like, well, the artists don't do what they want just because they want to. They have what they do is the tradition of the fathers, you see. So it's in a different, and so then that mentality perpetuated itself in the West, where it allowed for more flexibility among the painters, and while it was still within the framework of a pre-schism kind of like mindset of an ethos that united the totality of Christendom prior to the Great Schism, it was kept at bay. But once the Great Schism happens, and then there more fragmentation begins to happen, okay, and then the artists begin to, how you interpret that is difficult, because it's like my tendency is to hesitate from I'm sorry to use the term, grand narratives of imposing a interpretive lens that makes of everything that you look through it something evil. Like, for example, like I don't know if you're familiar with,
I totally agree,
with like I don't know if you're familiar with the evangelical, I think he might be a Calvinist theologian, Frank Schaeffer. Okay.
Oh God, I hate that. It's so
exactly.
Man, let me just tell you, I tried to read some of, and it was like postmodernism, bad. Nietzsche said God is dead, bad. And I'm like, God, Nietzsche is the greatest critique, like of Christianity. Like, take him on his own terms.
Right.
Yes, he's bad, but that's more than just bad.
That's sort of like my attitude too, because listen, I never went to school for iconography. I went to school for painting, like, and I was trained within a context that the framework, the paradigm was completely modernist and slash postmodernist. And so from undergrad through graduate school, one of the things that fascinated me throughout my studies was art theory, and a lot of the painting that developed in the 20th century is some of my favorite. And so it's like, I know that there are problems philosophically. There's plenty of problems in there, but I mean, that doesn't prevent me from finding beauty within that context, or finding an impulse towards truth within that context.
Sure.
Or you know what I'm saying? And or finding a dynamic that is a yearning for the divine, without even realizing that that's what it's all about, in terms of the artistic forms that were developed, even if inadvertently. We have to somehow learn to interpret in a way that is not a facile black and white kind of thing, while being careful not to, in our looking for nuance, like muddle things too much. So it's a hard thing. That's why people tend to, they would rather err towards either extreme, liberalism or extreme conservatism. It renders things a little bit more like, simple. But to me,
you gotta leave room on the edge.
You gotta be like, is both and. It's not, you can't go simplistic and polar. It's like you have to, take your time and not fall into an attempt to impose, for example, there is a liturgical art paradigm, but it seems to me like it is facile to want to impose that paradigm on secular art. You will never get the results that you're looking for because it's not liturgical art. So stop trying to find in secular art liturgical art, man.
So could you
like
say,
you're
for
saying
example,
about with
like
Nietzsche, like take him on his
Right.
own terms. Listen to what the heck he's saying. Read his book and see how he challenges you, where he's wrong and where he's got some grain of truth in what he's saying. Similarly with other stuff, like the non-liturgical art, secular art. You will find plenty.
So, I mean, we can just kind of take for granted, even if something's not appropriate for the liturgy, that doesn't mean that there's not beauty in it.
Right. Right.
Like Caravaggio is beautiful.
Yeah. No, there's no doubt about it. Listen, even painters that are considered to be like, unfashionable within like a secular paradigm of art history. Like, for example, like I love we're talking about it in the summit. I love the Mannerists. Parmigianino, the Madonna of the Long Neck, is one of my favorite paintings. Or Bronzino's portraits of the Medici family. That like weird, cold, stiff kind of like slickness. I love that stuff, man. These are all different variants of how do you deal with the challenge of beauty.
Or and then El Greco's the one that we were talking about, because Jonathan has the whole thing about El Greco's, everything is an upskirt and all of that, and it's like
that's just
come on, man.
Exactly. So what do you do when after what do you do after Da Vinci and Raphael or Michelangelo seem to have like completely reached the culmination of what was the task for the Renaissance painter or sculptor to do? What do? And then you get stylish, man. That's where mannerism comes. You start to hone in to form, and you explore it as an occasion to, the delectation of form. That goes too far, though. You have to be careful, because then it very easily devolves into the Oscar Wildean art for art's sake, where you forego ethical standards for the sake of just giving into the gratification of sensual pleasure through the eye or through the ear or whatever. You see? But nevertheless, it's like, and I want to touch on that whole sublime versus beauty thing. I haven't forgotten.
Yeah. Because I want to, is that an appropriate dichotomy? But
this whole problem was conjured up by Baudelaire in his Flowers of Evil. He has a poem there that I think has to be read in conjunction to Dostoevsky and beauty will save the world, and the battle is in the heart. He basically...
What's it called? Baudelaire's...
Flowers of Evil. That's the collection of poems. It's an infamous collection of poems, that helped to define the symbolist movement. But he has a poem on beauty there, and the last question is, where is it from? Is it from hell, or is it from heaven? And he gives various examples of how it could either be either or. But that's the problem.
Isn't that the Christian thing, though? I mean, that's what we were hitting on earlier. Is what I love, it's not just the subsummation or whatever the word is into the transcendent. It's Christianity is unique in that it doesn't just point up Christ both ascends and descends and fills the hierarchy.
Yeah, totally. Right? Totally, yes.
And so in that, there's the most beautiful thing is the most horrific.
Oh yeah. Yeah,
and so that which is holy is that which is horror. You know,
the which touches on the sublime thing. This is very important. But before I say something about that, let me just say, my dad used to say, you have to learn to find beauty even in a cockroach. And I used to be like, what the heck, what are you talking about, man? But that's another thing. But anyways, but the whole thing about horror and beauty, like you were saying, like beauty is usually only relegated to the realm of the sensuous, because this goes back to Edmund Burke and his philosophical inquiry into the ideas of the beautiful and the sublime. Okay, and that was influential on if I'm getting the chronology correct, on Kant's development of his own like critique of judgment, because I think Kant, before he did his critique of judgment, he did a little treatise on the sublime, if I'm not mistaken. In any case, and in which he was indebted to Burke. And if I'm wrong, after you do your research, you could put a footnote on the screen and say, Father Silouan was wrong, is actually this and that. Anyways, so in Edmund Burke, it's anything that is soft, anything that is smooth, voluptuous, is beautiful, is something that is controllable, that is within reach, is ready to be embraced, and all the other things that is pleasurable, basically, right? Because the definition that is medieval is that which pleases when it is seen. That is, if I'm not mistaken, that could have been a way of defining beauty by Aquinas. That which pleases when it is seen. But Aquinas had a more rigorous kind of like understanding of it. He's not just saying is sensuousness. He's saying it within the framework of perceiving with the mind the form of a thing. That's what pleases. And in that sense, in perceiving the form, you're engaged in an intellectual act, not just merely a sensuous act. It's not just about the eye and gratifying sensuousness. It is about, through the eye, hitting the intellectus, the noetic apprehension of how that outward form is ultimately the manifestation of an inner form. That's a different
Pause
thing.
real quick, because you had said this before, right? Like with the idea of the perfect balance between the intellect and the sensuous, right?
Yes.
So you'd said that before. I started to think about that a little bit. Can you move all the way into the romantic, and is there still balance there, or would you say the balance is always off? Because there is something about like a Mahler symphony.
You know who one of my favorite painters in the Romantic period is Caspar David Friedrich, and one of my another favorite Romantic painter is Blake. I would say that Friedrich is more in the realm of sense, and Blake is in the realm of intellect, but they're both in the gradient of sense.
Okay.
You see what I'm saying? So
is it too much, or is there still balance there in your opinion?
I think there's balance. I think because I think Friedrich is basically what Friedrich is saying. He's saying, look with me at the grandeur of nature, and perceive the power of God. Okay,
that seems to me like a very Western piety kind of move.
Yeah, but I mean that's just that's within the framework of that culture. I mean, but he's not giving you a narrative that gets you all juiced up, like right. It's just like like a mythological narrative, or a history narrative that is either violence or arrows, to the point where you have to learn how to look with discretion. You know what I'm saying? So
then in not a liturgical context, but just as in your philosophy when it comes to the appreciation of art, where is the point that it goes too far, where it's not balanced, and where now it's too sensuous and no intellect at all?
there's always going to be some intellect, but before I answer that question, let me get to the,
sorry,
because I have to think about that. Because it's like what painters can
John Vervaeke, not to interrupt, but he had like this super interesting definition of the romantic, which I'd never heard before, and I've used it several times, and I'm like, oh, that seems genius. I need to bounce this off somebody else to see if
what did he say?
Everyone agrees. He said that in Plato, that to move into rationality is to move into the real.
Okay.
But then for Kant, because of the Copernican revolution and epistemology, to move into the irrational is to move into the real. And so that then it's actually Kant's philosophy that provides the ground for the birth of Romanticism, because that lives into that. To move into the sensuous and the emotional is to move into the real. That just seemed like an interesting framework of thinking about Romanticism as such.
It's interesting. I think that is a false dichotomy in the West. That's that. Now I'm sounding like one of those Orthodox critics of the West that is too simplistic. Insofar as it goes back to your initial question, is beauty and the sublime always to be seen as two different categories? That is a phenomenon of an Enlightenment thought, that like you would analyze those two things as distinct and separate, right? But I would say that in scripturally speaking, and who picked this up? I think it was Rilke, because Rilke talks about like I think a manifestation of an angel or something like that, or he talks about beauty, but as like terrifying, and so when you look at scripture, when you experience the divine, people are just they collapse. But didn't we say in the beginning of this conversation that one of the names of God is beauty? You know what I'm saying? So you are both like perceiving the splendor of beauty, the splendor of perfection is another definition of the beautiful. Okay, you experience the splendor of perfection, but in perceiving that, you're torn into pieces, and you realize that you are like, depart from me because I'm a sinful man. I'm going to basically be obliterated by this perfection that like makes me realize that I'm so not in conformity with it. And it just strikes you with terror. So the two are intertwined. The two are intertwined. And so in some instances, the Lord, as a condescension, he takes on form, the incarnation.
Right.
And he makes himself more accessible in terms of beauty. But that doesn't mean that he wasn't striking fear to his disciples at times with his sublimity. Transfiguration.
Sure.
So he knew when to give a dosage of one or the other, but they're all in him. He embodies both. We, as creatures, could differentiate them in a logical level, at distinct things to analyze, but they are, they're coming from the same source, man. Just like nature has both the manifestation of a beautiful flower, and it has the grandeur of a storm in the midst of the abyss, of the ocean.
Right. They're both beautiful.
They're both beautiful,
but it's our reaction to it.
Is how they strike us. One, according to Kant, is that it goes beyond our capacity to wrap our minds around it. He has a category of the mathematical sublime or something like that. It's like you can't, like, you look at the stars and you can't really wrap your head around how many there are, and like you realize you your puniness in comparison to the magnitude of the universe, or you look at the mountains, in the Alps, and you're like struck with the grandeur of the height and the immensity, and then you're threatened by the height, or in the storm you're threatened by how the storm could obliterate you. And so there's different ways in which we are made aware of our finiteness in comparison to the grandeur and in the infinity of the cosmos, which serve as an icon of God's eternity, And so, but with beauty, it's more of something that like we are gratified by the experience, and it doesn't threaten our life, our existence. If anything, it comforts us, and it brings pleasure and joy.
You're saying this is like Kant's definition.
Those two, which are indebted to Edmund Burke. Yeah,
but in your estimation, beauty, that like you would say it is a false dichotomy, like beauty.
It is a dichotomy that has to be brought back into the fact that it ultimately is one in God, as how He manifests Himself. You could call. I'm not going to enter into analyzing it or like developing some kind of aesthetic theory based on God's energies and all that stuff, because I don't have the capacity. That's for somebody else to do. But if beauty is a reflection of beauty with a capital B, then by definition the sublime is a reflection of the threatening. What is it like? There's a term that that usually uttered in Latin, that the terribleness of the divine. Otto, what's his name? I forgot his name.
When the light becomes darkness, it's like the apophatic mystery.
The apophatic, exactly. Like the
So let me throw this at you, right? Because this is so. I love, and I don't think this is just Jonathan's definition, but I learned it from Jonathan. The idea that love is the reconciliation of multiplicity and unity. So this is like what Jonathan says, that like love. So that's like for him a definition of love, right? And so then,
that brings my mind to the Holy Trinity,
right? Which is how you could say that God is love,
right? Exactly. It's like the perichoresis of the Holy Trinity, like the constant communion that exists between the three persons in unity. The unity in diversity, diversity in unity, that different hypotheses.
And so if that diversity and unity is love itself, like that's the definition of love itself, and then that's how we can say that ontologically God is love, then I'm kind of wondering, and I don't know what the ramifications are of this, or maybe this is just silly on my part, but how Aquinas talks about the transcendentals, so that like beauty, goodness, and truth, sort of like Dionysius, because they're all I think he gets it from Dionysius.
He gets it from
because
Dionysius.
because they're names for God, they're ultimately convertible. So the convertibility of the transcendentals, right? So then if beauty is that, and then love is how we define, like ontologically God is love, and love is the reconciliation of multiplicity and unity, then can we say that like beauty and love are convertible in the same way that beauty, goodness, and truth is? And so then if you take that framework, so beauty and love being convertible, if we grant that, then can you sort of extrapolate from that, like that part of what beauty is, maybe there's some means of determining how things come into one. It's like, I haven't worked it out. This is why I'm kind of throwing it at you. But if it's like multiplicity and unity, can that give a framework for like looking at some horribly modernist building and saying no, that violates that principle, and then also looking at like La Sagrada Familia and saying, oh, this is gorgeous, this is beautiful, because there is some play of multiplicity and unity that ultimately reflects the divine.
I see what I'm saying. I see what you mean. It's hard because, again, it's like we're dealing with like metaphysical like principles, and they're philosophically useful, but on the ground, as aesthetic forms, that's where it becomes difficult to, and you don't want to run the risk of then appearing, I'm not saying that that's what you're doing, appearing to give formulae to metaphysical principles in a visual form that then ends up into dogmatizing specific forms.
Right, it's like the problems that we were talking about earlier. Yeah,
exactly. That's always my worriness about that stuff, you know. And so,
but because of that, there seems to be something. It's not just how much someone loves something, because someone can love a painting and it'd be terrible.
Yeah, totally. There's no doubt about it.
But there is something about perfect love that I think is teleological.
Yeah.
You know, about perfect love that has to do with that reconciliation, but is also perfectly teleological. And I think there's something there I don't know how to articulate, where when I see something that's modernist or postmodernist, even if there's like a vestige of beauty in there, there's an insight that's good, the telos of the thing is ultimately destruction. It's like,
I see what you mean. I see, yeah.
You know, where it's like, we want to destroy Western society, and this is a means of destruction.
Yeah, but,
whereas then, then there's like, if I, like, you know, crazy example, I listen to like Kendrick Lamar, you know, the rapper. It's like, you can tell that he has so much love for the whole rap tradition. You know, there's something beautiful there. You know, it's
well, but that's the.
I might be a little left field on that one, but you know, you follow what I'm saying? It's like,
I know what you mean. I know. Yeah, because, but also you're also dealing with. There's a lot. I mean, what you say, like, there's a lot there. But check this out. I think in terms of telos, like some of the modernist architects, painters, or whatever, they, you know, every evil has a seeming good in it that the person is going after. You know what I'm saying? So there is a deceptive, like, you know, vestige of the good telos, like, you know, for example, like,
right, too much love for your own people ends up, you know,
exactly,
or too much love for the foreigner. It's like, either can create an issue. You know?
So like in like the modernists were into progress. Okay, so they and progress was deemed good because like it would bring about the well-being of humanity. I mean, so in a sense that there is some seeming, you know, good there, you know what I'm saying? And so some seeming, like, you know, love for humanity in there, you know. But so then, like, we have to be careful with claiming that anything that comes out of like an ugly building tradition, like brutalism, for example, is necessarily like had a bad telos, because I don't think that those architects were per se wanting to deface Western civilization. They thought of what they were doing as advancing a good, you know, in their minds.
And Andrew is quick to point out that brutalism and international modern are not exactly the same thing.
True.
And that secretly all architects have at least a little bit of appreciation for like the crazy, ingenious brutalist buildings, even if they wouldn't want to build one themselves.
And there is also a truth, I would say, of Loos or whatever his name was, the Austrian architect, about like his anti-ornamentalism. I mean, there is. I'm soft on dialing it back a little bit on ornament. You know what I'm saying? Because ornament could get a little bit carried away. It's like, it's frivolous at times, man. And
but it can also be like the surfeit of grace from God.
You know who was a good example of that in the Western tradition for me? Vivaldi's Baroque ornamentalism. That to me is, you probably don't like Vivaldi here, like whatever. You know, I
like Vivaldi.
Yeah, I like some of that stuff.
My hero is Bach, of course. Yeah. But no, Vivaldi's great. And Bach loved Vivaldi for whatever it's worth. He actually like imitated him in several, like he wrote like 3 transcriptions of Vivaldi concertos for the organ. Very good. So there was you know, he wanted to know the Italian, French, and German styles, and so he would like imitate and then kind of subsume it into his own. Right.
Right.
You know. Anyway.
So that's all I'm saying. All I'm saying is that, like, the result could, in retrospect, be seen as destructive to Western civilizational values. But perhaps what the telos in the mind of what the artists were trying to do was actually to bring that Western cultural development into a stage that was deemed more advanced given the promises of technology and so on and so forth, And so, of course,
but it seems like international modern, the telos is profit. You see what I mean? Like let's just build some ugly skyscraper
yes.
that's just glass. There's no actual aesthetic telos to it. There's just we're built.
Yes. It's expediency, utilitarianism. It's like it's got no.
There's got to be a point at which we can say that is not beautiful.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I'm not denying that, and I agree 100%. But getting back to the whole question of love that you were positing, I think is an important category to keep in mind in light of beauty, because beauty is to arouse your eros.
Right.
That's the point of beauty. I mean, it gives you the erotic desire to unite with God. And I use that in a provocative term, in a way, because Dionysius himself in his corpus, he actually brings that term up, and he says, I know that some will think that in me using this term, I'm being inappropriate, but I'm using it based on scripture. And basically, he's saying that there is the divine eros in his desire to impart his love, creates and imbues everything with beauty in order to inspire and instill in his creatures the erotic desire to return to the source. It's a procession and return, and is always predicated on love, on eros. And that is
uniting.
Exactly. And it is the instrumental glory that woos the creature towards that union is beauty.
Awesome. Yeah. I also, I was talking about Vervaeke earlier in his definitions. He was saying there's something about when you compare the Greek definitions of the words for love, where eros has something to do with consumption as well.
That's why
that would make sense on eating the bread and blood to unite with God, right?
Yeah.
So you'd say he's correct on that, on the consumption thing.
if seen within the lens of our tradition, because it's like he came to heal us from our turning ugly by disobeying him. He became form to woo us with the beauty of his incarnation, so we could be united with him through his body and blood and partaking of him in the Eucharist. It's all intertwined, man. Beauty and love. It's like in there.
Do you like Bach? I know you like Bach. You should buy a copy of my CD, Bach's Klavierübung Dritte Teil, at the Waltershausen Trostorgan, which you can purchase on my website, MatthewWilkinson.net. There is a link below.